Maybe you could give me more of a sense of what you're looking for.
Anything in the realm of women turning into animals.
Hi, I'm Marielle Heller. I'm the director of Nightbitch, and I'm here in the IndieWire studio in New York to discuss the film on the Toolkit podcast.
I would love to start by asking you a little bit about the breakfast montage that kind of opens the film. Hash browns, because it feels as visceral as any transformation into animals that happened later in the film. And also, I was watching it, and it felt to me very much like this is something that has been on the burner for you for a while and felt like a great cinematic release.
Yes.
So I'm curious how you thought about that montage, both from scripting and from the editing, because the rhythm of it, I think, is really key to getting into the mother's emotion.
Yeah. When I became a parent, I guess I didn't really realize how monotonous a lot of it would be. You know, you kind of have visions of what parenting will be like, and it's a lot of snuggles and reading books or doing puzzles together, and you don't realize how much of it is making food and your child not eating the food that you make and just feeling like you're like replaying the same day over and over again. And I had somebody once say, like, a good way to think about parenting early childhood is you just think of everything as little chunks of time, and you're just trying to spend chunks of time. And you'll be like, we'll go to the park. That's 2 chunks. Anyway, so when reading Rachel Yoder's beautiful book, she kind of described this idea of the day repeating and feeling like you haven't even changed your clothes and you don't know what day it is anymore. And it brought me back so much to that feeling. And I was trying to think about how to make that cinematic and came up with this sort of what I felt like was a visceral, very emotionally resonant montage of her kind of making food and going to the park and walking the same kind of few blocks. And I always imagined it with a sort of very percussive, I was thinking a lot about the sounds of that montage and how, you know, when you're really tired, the kind of sounds that are pleasant otherwise can be really unpleasant.
Yeah.
And those morning sounds of like a clank or a whatever it might be, or a squeak of a swing are like grating on you. And so that was sort of the impulse, and I was trying to think about each action with having a kind of percussive element so that we could have a lot of fun in the edit. So it was pretty well planned out in that way, and then my editor and I had so much fun, and she found little things that I hadn't even planned on too, like there's a moment where the son says 7, 8, and it sounds like he's counting off the percussive elements and things like that.
Yeah,
that really
it just
fun.
gels really well. I'm always so fascinated with folks who both write and direct, just like how the overlap in the Venn diagram of writing and directing works. And it sounds like sound is very important to you.
Yes.
Do you write a lot of sound? Do you write very visually, or do you sort of kind of leave that chambered in your brain and come back to it when you're planning a shoot?
Because I know I'm directing my own scripts, I can kind of write them more as like a little cheat sheet for myself than really expecting other people to be able to interpret it correctly. I think when you're writing something that you know someone else is going to direct, you have to be really careful to write it in a way that someone else can interpret. But for me, I can just write it in a way that only I have to know. And the actors, of course. And, of course, all of my team has to be able to read it and understand what I meant to some extent, but I can always explain it. But I do lead with hearing things, I guess. I have sort of rhythms in my head. I think it comes from being a theater actor. In Shakespeare's day, you would say we're going to hear a play, not going to see a play. And I think more than visually, I tend to kind of lead with that sense, and I, especially with dialogue, I really hear the rhythms of dialogue and the build of dialogue in my head, and then the visual elements kind of come second to me, which I don't think is typical.
I mean, it makes sense, though, especially in a story like this that is about relationships among a family, the character's relationship to themselves, like being able to find the words and say the right words, and the tension that arises in that, like, dictates, I would imagine, the setups and how much coverage and how long you spend and all of that.
Definitely. And the sort of kind of emotional build that I think can happen when you know what's the most tense moment of a scene or what's the moment that kind of erupts in anger and what's the moment where things are just slow and simmering, or what are the moments where it's about the pauses and what's being said in not in the words, all of that subtext.
I'm also curious, like, if you know or sort of have in mind an actor to say some of this dialogue. Does that change things for you at all? Like, are you sneaking little gifts and little challenges in, or do you try and focus on story first and then figure out who's going to embody the person later?
I guess when I'm writing, I do have sort of someone speaking the words out loud in my head. So like in the case of this, where Amy Adams was involved from the very beginning and I knew she was going to be saying these words, I could kind of picture her.
Yeah.
But even when I don't have an actor in mind, I realize it almost is like there's a person saying the word. You know, you have to imagine your dialogue being spoken, and I often speak out loud when I'm writing. So sometimes what I go through in the casting process is I'm trying to match up someone to what I've seen in my head a little bit, I think, without even consciously doing it. It's like I've created some person who's saying these lines, and I can kind of see what they look like and how they sound. It's often, as I said, kind of about how they sound. And so then it's about when people come in and audition and read the words, it's like, wait, is that how I heard it? I've had a few actors tell me that it's a little frustrating that I know exactly how I want certain things to sound. They're like, oh, you have this in your head, don't you, exactly how this is supposed to sound? I was like, I guess I do. Sorry.
I've heard you talk about some of the changes from novel to film, the cat's death being adjusted, so that which thank you for doing that.
Yeah. I mean, it's still a cat's death, which is still intense and hard.
Yeah. There's some things that can absolutely live on the page, and there are some things that will not work visually and vice versa.
Absolutely. When you see things actually in front of your eyes, sometimes you can't recover from things as easily as when you're imagining them when you're reading a novel.
Absolutely.
Another example, so to talk about the cat's death, yes. In the book, she kills the cat in her human form, and it's really bloody and horrible. And when I wrote the script, I changed it to her killing the cat in the dog form. And Rachel Yoder, to her great credit, was like, oh, that was so the right call. Like, we could not have handled that in the movie. Similarly, in the book, she had, and these are all kind of slight spoilers, but she had the son sleep in a dog crate. And
yeah, the difference between a crate and a bed.
Yeah, I was like, I don't think I can see a kid in a cage, especially with our immigration issues in our country and all of this. I was like, I think that's a bad visual. I think it will be pretty tough. So, yeah, that was actually Ann Carey's call, one of my producers. She was like, I don't think you want to see that. I was like, good call.
Yeah.
Dog bed.
No, it's so fascinating kind of what translates to get the same idea across. But I'm also curious, like, what you felt strongly about, not just in terms of plot, but just sort of the way that the novel works, keeping. Like, it's interesting to me that the characters are the mother, the father, the son, which feels very literary.
Mother, husband, son.
Mother, husband, son. Thank you.
It is very literary, but what I liked about that was that it does feel, I think, when you're experiencing a loss of identity, and motherhood is such a moment of sort of the focus of your life goes so drastically from being yourself to being someone else that it felt like it just worked on an emotional level for that experience. You know, I mean, I often feel like people don't know my name in my, life as a mom. Like, it's just like I'm my kid's mom. Mm-hmm. People will call me, Wiley's mom, can you come do you have a snack, or whatever it might be. Yeah. And I've even had moments with my kids when they're really little where I'm like, do you know what my name is? Like, you realize you you've kind of lost this real kind of self-centered version where your life is so centered around your identity, and it becomes so much about the identity of your kid. Sort of like, I mean, with dogs too, you know, walking around on the street, like I know all the dogs in my neighborhood now, and I often don't know their owners' names. So it's a similar kind of thing, and I thought it worked well.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
You might make it through the movie too and not realize that nobody really has a
That's
name.
the thing. It's a sneaky part of the film is that you can kind of get pretty far into the movie without realizing.
I also have this memory when I had my son. My husband and I would slip into conversation about him where we would just use he all the time as though he were the only person in the world. You know, it'd be like we've just seen each other and it was like, oh, he woke up in the middle of the night, or oh, he's got diarrhea, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And it's like we're talking about him and we both immediately know who we're talking about. We don't have to set it up. There's this sort of, he was so the focus of everything we would talk about in the beginning. So I found that just to be very true to human nature, too.
Yeah.
When you're in families and you're so, like, head down dealing with what you're dealing with, family life in that moment, it's kind of how you talk to each other.
Speaking of kids, I had a moment just kind of realizing that there was probably a ton of invisible work going into a small child waving at a garbage truck right at the moment when the camera needed that to happen.
Yes.
So I'd love to ask you about kind of working with toddlers and kind of all of the shadow organization that goes on to make that stuff feel organic.
Invisible labor is the theme of the movie, let's be honest, because motherhood is largely invisible labor. Yeah, it was a huge goal of mine to be able to capture a relationship between a mother and a child that felt authentic, because for me, when I watch most movies or TV that has little kids, it feels like total bullshit.
Yeah.
You know, it's like this perfect little actor kid doing actory things that don't feel like a real kid, or it's parents responding in ways that don't feel real, you know? So it is the sort of subtle work of the film, but it was the majority of the energy that we put into the film was actually really trying to capture a very, very honest relationship between a mother and a very little kid. So it's twins who we cast as the son, Emmett and Arlie, and they were amazing. They had never acted before. They turned 3 on our camera test day. And the reason I cast them, and I auditioned a ton of twins.
I can only imagine.
Yeah. And my audition process was not like an audition process. It was just hanging out in the park and playing with kids over and over again for hours on end to really see who could do all of the things we needed to do and who could, like, be really playful and rambunctious, but also follow direction when needed, but seem really real and not be self-conscious and not get too shy around strangers and all of these different things that had to happen. And then a huge amount of work was about creating an environment where they felt really safe, where they knew everybody on set, they understood everything that was happening, they knew the expectations, they knew if somebody's coming up with a microphone, they knew his name and what he was doing and why he was there and how the microphone worked. And almost everyone on set was a parent or was very familiar with little kids, which was a very helpful thing because everybody kind of collectively decided we were going to make this a really fun place for these kids.
Yeah.
And then it was a lot of lying in bed the night before thinking through, okay, how am I going to set up this scene for these kids so that they can do what I need them to do? Like you said, wave at this moment or say a certain line or throw a plate and break it on the floor or whatever it was, slip and paint, but make it seem really, really natural. So it's about setting up environments where then they suddenly do these things, or I give them a little idea to do these things, and we hopefully capture it at the right moment.
Yeah.
So it was making everything into a game. There was a lot of, like, teaching them almost acting games where we would do, like, call and response, you know, and sometimes using reverse psychology of, like, don't bark, whatever you do, don't bark right now or something, or barking at them and seeing how they respond and seeing if they'll bark back at me. the majority of the time when they're on camera, I'm the one behind the camera acting with them, if I'm being honest, because we formed such a bond. So it was really often they're looking at me and giving me that little mischievous look or spraying me with a water bottle or barking back at me or something, because I was really kind of aware of what I needed to get from them and how to get it from them. And so it was a lot of like me forming this relationship, which was a little awkward when my 2-year-old daughter visited set and she walked on set and saw these 2 little boys like in my lap. And I felt like I was cheating on my own daughter with them.
Showbiz.
Yeah.
Wild.
I know. The look on her face was like, what is happening here?
Why was I not aware of this?
Exactly. This is your work? This is it? What? I have this memory of, I think it was day 2, where we filmed the scene where the kid is supposed to get lost in the park, and we had him sitting in the grass, and he had just met Amy like the day before, and they really liked each other, but she's still almost a stranger.
Yeah.
And then suddenly we're filming a scene where she's screaming at the top of her lungs and running at the kid. And he just got up and started booking it across the park. Like, of course.
Of course.
A very natural response. And it was like, oh, we have to figure out how to make this part of it a game.
Yeah.
And get him involved in this and let him know what's happening and that no one's mad at him and all of these things. So, yeah, it was a lot of work.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah. And I'm really proud of that aspect of the film. I feel like the number of people who say to me, like, oh, my God, I just felt like that was the most honest portrayal of a mother and a kid. Like, how did you do that? I'm like, yeah, it was so much work every day.
It feels that way. And it also, you have sort of a big, quote-unquote, genre concept going on. Suburbia or has been covered all kinds of different heightened ways, but this film looks really real.
Yeah.
Not even, sort of like Instagram real. It just looks really real.
Hopefully not Instagram real.
Yeah. So I'd love to ask you kind of about working with Brandon and Karen and everybody about the look of the film.
In the same way that I got really attached to this idea from the book of the anonymity of the mother and the husband and the son, I also kind of expanded that out to our look, where it was like, this is a couple who, she was an artist, they were hip and cool, living in the city at some point, and they moved out to the suburbs.
Yeah.
And how has that informed their life? But I wanted to keep it in that sort of anonymous zone, so we made it any city in the U.S. and any suburb in the U.S. And I had in my head what our reference points were, which was truthfully like New York and New Jersey.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to anchor it in that. I wanted it to have this sort of like, it could be any city and any cool city that had a big art scene, and it could be any suburb. And yet it all had to be, and then similarly I wanted it to be sort of timeless, where you don't know really what year we're in. We're not super anchored in technology or cars or anything that tells you
Right.
it's this very modern moment, because I think the experience that she's going through is so universal. And I love movies that feel timeless too, if I'm being honest. I just like taking technology out of the mix and grounding it in human interactions, but also just letting things feel a little more timeless. So that became the guiding force and Karen Murphy was an incredible asset, our production designer. She really understood how to approach this from a character point of view of like, this is an artist. What kind of home would she buy in the suburbs, even if she was making that big change of moving from the city into the burbs? Like, what kind of architecture would she look for? What would she like? How can we find a home that represents who they used to be, and then it's just got like a layer of kid crap on top of like this more interesting starter home? They don't have a ton of money, but they do have taste, and they might have art that she maybe traded her own artwork for friends' art, and she has really good taste underneath it all, but then it's got like baby gates and toys all over it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
A nice couch that maybe has spit up on it was sort of our aesthetic we were going for. And we ended up looking at 60 different houses. I sort of have this thing with movies where it's like, I never want you to see the effort that went into all of the choices. I want it to seem like it just happened, like it's just real.
Yeah.
both like the performances between the kid and the mother and like how that just feels just real, but also just the house and the lived-in nature of it and how. But the truth is, there is this invisible labor that goes into all of these choices. I had so many specific ideas of what I wanted this house to look like, as did Karen, as did Brandon. Things like we wanted a non-updated kitchen. We wanted there to be a window where she could look out from doing the dishes and see her husband come and go like she was in a cage. You know, there were a huge laundry list that ended up making it weirdly very, very difficult to find a house. This house I ended up finding on Zillow, and it was for sale at 2 a.m. after we had looked at 60 other houses, and we were able to convince the people who were selling the house to let us film there.
Incredible.
Yeah. But that is always sort of my aesthetic when it comes to filmmaking is I don't want the flashy choices where you're like, look at that directing choice. I want it to just feel character-based and lived in and that it's coming from the emotions and the truth of the characters. But that doesn't make for people really recognizing what went into the work.
It is there, though. And, you know, it does, like,
everything's very consciously picked out.
Absolutely. Everything is intentional. Everything is a choice. I love the mother's art show at the end.
Yes.
Feels incredibly true to her, and also just, like, every single one of those pieces had to be come up with.
That was all Karen Murphy. She and I were very dedicated to the idea that if we were going to have an art show in a movie, it had to feel real. Yeah. It had to be good art that you could recognize as good art, and you could recognize everything that went into it. And we went through so many different phases of trying to figure out if we were going to have a art consultant or hire an artist, and really what ended up being is Karen, who's very connected to the art world, curated this entire show, and it was one of the last things we filmed because it took so long and so much work to make all of that artwork. Mm-hmm. Both the paintings, which we came up with this concept of this sort of 50s housewife turned on its side, kind of, and we took beautiful photographs of our actresses, and then she had them painted into paintings, and then I had a friend of mine, Laurie Peterman from theater school, who makes incredible masks, and we gave her pictures of the main 4 dogs of the movie, and she made a mask for each of the main 4 dogs with aspects of their personality. Like, so much care and artistry went into all of the artwork that's in that final show.
Yeah, that's great. I have kind of an unwieldy question, but hopefully it'll lead to somewhere interesting. I apologize if it doesn't.
I like an unwieldy question.
As not a mother, unfortunately for me, one of the things that I recognized and was like, I know exactly what that is, are the mother's snooty art friends. And
I've been there too, my friend.
Listen, this is what film school will do.
Yeah.
Seeing a lot of both very good and very bad, pretentious movies makes me think all the time about how films treat ambiguity. There's an art and a beauty to leaving space for the audience to interpret something, to come to their own conclusions about a character, to, not need to overly explain the mechanics of how something happens. But then there are films that are themselves, in their visual language, confused about what's going on.
Totally different.
Yep, and it's a totally different thing.
Yep.
And so I'm curious how you think about being ambiguous but also clear when you're dealing with a character's subjectivity.
That's a good question. I have a thing where I feel like, for some reason, notes have started to shift. When people give notes on a script or on a film, notes have become focused on clarity recently instead of allowing it to be possibly purposefully ambiguous, which bothers me because I don't like things to be always spelled out or spoon-fed to an audience. I tend to believe audiences are smart and can figure things out and lean in more when things leave a little bit to be figured out or interpreted.
Audiences like to feel smart, too.
Yes, and I make movies for people who are smart. So I do feel like there's this fight when writing a script or making a movie that is purposefully a little bit ambiguous to stop people from just overnoting it and being like, but could this be clearer? Could that be clearer? There's a lot of ambiguity in this movie. There's a lot of ambiguity about what's real and what's not real, what's in her head and what's not in her head. Yeah. I felt like a huge amount of my work in protecting the story I have this kind of visual thing where, like, when I'm making a movie, I feel like I'm, like, walking around protecting it from everybody's good intentions. It's not like anyone's trying to mess up your movie. Everybody's trying to help, but you have to learn how to interpret what's going to be a helpful note and what's not a helpful note. And sometimes, for me, the least helpful notes are the ones of, like, but how do we make this more clear? Maybe we should have, like, a bell go off every time she's in fantasy so we all know it's fantasy moment.
Right.
And it's like, no. How about you don't know? Let's play with this idea. And I had so much fun in the shooting of this movie playing with her experience and not knowing at times whether what she's experiencing is real or not. And at least for me, my experience of extreme fatigue and sort of mental anguish and the moments in my life where I've felt like the least in my body and connected to my reality is like, it's not always clear. You're kind of can be floating a little bit, and that experience is a hard thing to explain. So I love ambiguity. I love that there's interpretation. I feel like at every Q&A of this movie, somebody's raising their hand and going, can you explain what blah, blah, blah meant? And I'm like, what did you think it meant? Of course I have my own interpretation. I have very clear ideas about what every single thing in this movie, from like the choice of a coffee cup to what some big metaphor means. But I'm trying to hold back and not over-clarify for everybody, because I think it's much more exciting when we're all having a big discussion about it. I also found with Rachel Yoder's book, I had these very clear ideas of what I thought it all meant. And then I had my book club read the book, and I had my mom's book club read the book. And I spoke to both book clubs about, like, everybody's interpretation, and they were so wildly different. Like, my mom's book club, who've been together for, I think, 40 years of reading books, and mostly women in their 70s, had totally varying ideas about what this book meant and what each part meant. And they got into, like, a huge argument while I was on Zoom with them about the book, about whether it was a metaphor, or whether she just had postpartum depression, or she needs to go to a doctor, or this is happening, oh, give me a break. Like, and someone else being like, I connected to the rage, and someone else saying, I did not connect to the rage. What are you talking about? So it was very interesting, and I wanted that type of discussion to happen with the movie. I like that. I love that about the film, but also that you know what yours is, and the movie, that's the key. Yeah, the choices reflect that you have a take. Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think you can make a movie unless you know exactly what everything means, because the truth is every single person, when you're the director and writer, every single person on set, whether it's the props person or the actors, are going to come up to you and go, what does this mean? What does this mean? Why am I doing this? And you have to know everything. Yeah. And with a story like this that's so personal and comes from source material I love so much, but then I also brought so much of my own life to the story, I had an answer for absolutely everything. Well, thank you so much again for talking to me about Nightbitch, this wonderful movie. Thank you.